All right, so while we're finishing up this poll that we're taking live, I just wanted to introduce our next speaker, Carly Siskind. Genetics is always an interesting topic in all of our seminars, and Carly is a licensed and certified genetic counselor with over 13 years experience in neuromuscular genetics. She currently is a senior genetic counselor and clinical associate professor affiliated at Stanford Healthcare in California. She did her undergraduate study at the University of Michigan and received her master's in genetic counseling from Northwestern. Her main interests are Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease and newborn screening for SMA and other neuromuscular disorders. So thanks for being with us here at Carly today. I am going to go ahead and launch our results of the poll. We have about 57% of our audience has voted. So I'm going to go ahead and let you see what that is. So for everybody on the line, you are probably seeing the poll results now. And Carly, I will go ahead and stop my sharing of the screen, and you can go ahead and share your screen and go ahead with your presentation.
Oh, thanks, Nicole. And thanks everybody for doing your poll there. That was actually super interesting. And I don't know if you all can see the result of that as well.
Yeah, everybody can see it.
Great.
So, or they should be too anyway. If you just, if you scroll down with your mouse or your phone with your finger, everybody should be able to see the poll results.
And I think that one of the things that's super interesting about the results is that I kind of threw in some of these things like, I'm just here to learn, because I thought, well, I don't know what everybody's here for. And it's really nice to see that this is actually that some of these thoughts are true. So thank you everyone for doing that. And also that like every type of inheritance that I plan to talk about is in that poll. And the one that I plan not to talk about is not in that poll. So thanks everyone for playing along with how I wanted you to vote. And I hope that I'll get to a lot of these points today. Nicole, can I just confirm that you can see the correct screen? You can just see the regular screen. I'll just assume you can. Unless someone tells me different, I'm going to assume you can see what you're supposed to see.
I'm muted. I'm sorry. I unmuted myself. I can see your notes at the bottom. Now we're good.
Okay, thank you so much. So again, Nicole and MD, I want to thank you for having me here. I do have one disclosure, which is that I did receive an honorarium for a visiting professorship at Genentech last year. And I'm going to go back for a second because my topic is supposed to be influence of genetics, but I really also want to include this idea that it's not just influence, but it's really impact of genetics. And the talk by Dr. Waldrop really just transitions very well into what I'm about to talk about. And we have a lot of similar thoughts about how genetics can impact not just people, but families. So that's going to be a big part of what I talk about, the influence of genetics, the impact of genetics not just on people, but also on the family system. And I'm going to talk a lot about genetics and inheritance and like why of genetics. And then hopefully I'll still have time for questions at the end. So let me start with that influence. So of course, I want to start with saying that not all conditions covered by the MDA are genetic, and that showed up in the poll as well. So myasthenia gravis is not genetic, the endocrine myopathies are not genetic, the inflammatory myopathies are not genetic. But those that are, they affect not just the person with the neuromuscular disorder, but the whole family system. And I guess I can really say that the whole family system is affected even by those conditions that are not genetic, just they don't have that genetic component also in them that's adding on to the impact of the condition. There's a lot of ways in which the family is impacted by a genetic diagnosis. And this really starts at the beginning. And for some families, there's a family history of a condition. And there may be a concern about this in a new child, or it could be a first person in the family that's affected with a genetic condition. Either way, having this new diagnosis or a new person diagnosed in the family can be a challenge for the family. It may be having to adapt to a life that's different from what was expected. And there's that whole process of learning about the diagnosis and what it is and what it means and what's now, what's next. How can I make this better? And it's more than just that learning piece. There are all of these emotions that go into this. And they run the gamut from things that are, Dr. Waldorf did a great job of showing like the whole process of grief and what happens with the new diagnosis. And things that come up a lot are things like guilt and anger. But really, there is this flip side of the emotions. It's not all just doom and gloom having a child with a neuromuscular condition. There's finding a new community. There's finding people to relate with you. There's the empathy that comes with having a person who has more challenges than the next person. There's altruism of having the ability to add to research and add to the next generation, what's going to come from that. And certainly, you parents probably know better than any one of us of how awesome your kids actually are. And bringing that up and remembering that your kids can be awesome, not in spite of a condition, but perhaps even because of a condition, or because they're an awesome kid just to begin with. And all of these emotions are totally valid and are totally real. There can be a lot of difficulty in talking and thinking about other family members. So that might be the nuclear family right at the home, or that could be aunts, uncles, grandparents, people who live in other countries. How does this affect the way that they're thinking about themselves, about their child, grandchild, niece, nephew? And what does it mean for them in their own families and their own health? So all of these go into the emotional side of a genetic condition. And there's a lot of physical sides to having a genetic condition as well. And families can all look different. So while some people may have a family structure with 2 able-bodied parents and 2 able-bodied children, that is obviously not universal. And families with neuromuscular disorders also need to think about more than just like the always difficult task of raising children. And it's that sometimes there's that person in the family who is the first ones that's affected, and the parents need to find out how to live with a child that needs mobility assistance and the changing mobility assistance over time. And what does that look like? And what does that mean for things like, what kind of a house do you need? Sometimes it's the parent that's affected, and the ways that care responsibilities are done in the household change from what perhaps is possible in an able-bodied house to a house where only one of the person is able to do as much stuff. Maybe there is something as simple as walking, taking the child for a walk that might be really difficult for a parent if that person has mobility difficulties. And what if the parent is affected and the child starts crawling and that baby is crawling across the room and you are like, I cannot keep up with you, baby. Or when that child becomes a teenager and that teenager gets a power wheelchair and is way faster than the parent. What does the parent do in those situations? And there's the questions about the future, about what's going to happen when a parent gets old and when the parents are no longer able to take care of their kids. What's the next step? What should be the expectations for their children? And of course, there's also disabilities that can come with neuromuscular disorders that are somewhat hidden. There can be hearing difficulties, there can be visual difficulties, and these things are sometimes less visible, but are no less impactful to the family. So basically my point is that these are physical ways that genetics can impact a family. There's the emotional ways that genetics can impact a family. And they're all important and they're all part of the family system. So let me go through genetics. So this is my spiel that I get to tell everyone. So I hope that this all makes sense. So this is a picture of the chromosomes. So we typically have 46 chromosomes in nearly every cell in our body. The chromosomes contain all of the information our body needs in order to grow and develop and function. And they can be arranged based on their size and their stripes into pairs, so that we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, where we get one member of each pair from the egg and the other member of each pair from the sperm. And likewise, when we have kids, we pass along one member of each of these chromosome pairs, and our partner passes along the other member of the pair. That's how we get 50-50 from each of our parents. And the first 22 pairs of these are exactly the same in males and females. We have all the same information, all the same genes. The only place that we differ is in the sex chromosomes, which are the last chromosomes. So females typically have 2 X's, and males typically have an X and a Y chromosome. And that's the only place where the sex differences occur, is because of these sex chromosomes. Otherwise, all the information is the same. And just like we have 2 of every chromosome, we have 2 of every gene. So we have about 20,000 genes that are arranged along our 23 chromosome pairs. So they're very, very, very tiny. And I have a little blow up here, my own cartoon. So if these are 2 chromosomes, again, one from the egg, one from the sperm, there's a portion on it that would be a gene. So that we have 2 copies of each gene, one from the egg and one from the sperm. And our genes are made up of DNA, which is basically just a code. It's a series of letters that, when it's spelled correctly, lets the gene do its function. And every gene has a specific function within the body. Problems can happen when there's a change in this DNA code. For example, if this T was a C, or a couple were missing, or a couple were added in. Anything that changes the DNA code can make that gene not work properly. Those types of changes to the DNA code that cause the gene to not work properly are called mutations. There are more technical terms within the scientific community, so you might also hear them being called variants, or disease-causing variants, or pathogenic variants. But I think most people have actually heard of mutation, and so that's where we tend to talk about it with families. And in your poll, you all answered, excuse me, different types of inheritances that you have. And I saw a bunch of the different types of conditions also that you have. And so let me kind of go through some of these things. But before I start, I want to make this very clear, or hopefully very clear, that once there is a form of inheritance in the family, that is the inheritance for the family. So it doesn't change from one to a different one. It's always going to be the same. And once there is a genetic cause that is found in the family, that genetic cause is going to be the same. So for example, if you inherited a family heirloom from your grandmother, let's say you got a crystal ball from your grandmother, and you could pass that down to your kids. But your kid could go out to the store and like buy a new crystal ball, but it's not going to be that same crystal ball that you got from your grandmother. Only things that can be passed down in families are the exact same thing. So I bring that up because I don't want, people always ask this question about like skipping generations. And that really is not something that occurs. It is something that you have to inherit, that crystal ball that has to be passed down from generation to generation in order to inherit a condition. So that being said, let me talk about the inheritances. So dominant inheritance would be the majority of the forms of Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, LMNA form of Emery-Dreifuss muscular dystrophy, some forms of other muscular dystrophies, myotonic dystrophy. Those would be dominant inheritance. And in this situation, what happens is that this is my gene again, that one copy of the gene is working just fine, but one copy of the gene has a mutation. And all it takes in dominant inheritance is to have one copy of that gene to have a mutation in order for a person to be affected. In every pregnancy, again, you pass on one copy of your gene and your partner passes on the other copy of the gene. So that in every pregnancy, there are 4 possible ways for the genes to be passed on. In essence, in dominant inheritance, it boils down to a 50-50 chance of passing on the condition. If a person does inherit the mutation, then that person will be affected. We can't necessarily say how severe those symptoms will be, but that person would also have that same 50-50 chance of passing it on in the future. If a person does not inherit the condition, that person will not be affected, will not have symptoms of the condition, and cannot pass it on. It stops. It is possible to be the first person in the family to be affected with the condition, so it isn't something that a person inherited. And in that case, then we wouldn't see a parent that's affected, but that person who is affected would begin this sequence here, where that person would become that first person affected in the family, and then would have that 50-50 chance of passing it on. There is also recessive inheritance. This is many of the other forms of muscular dystrophy. So for example, the sarcoglycanopathies, many forms of the congenital myopathies are recessive, spinal muscular atrophy is recessive. And in recessive inheritance, a person needs to have a mutation in both copies of the gene in order to be affected. If they have a mutation in one copy of the gene, they are not affected. They do not have signs, symptoms, any issues associated with the condition. They would have no idea that they are a carrier for the condition. And I spilled the beans there. Having a mutation in one copy of the gene, but not on the other copy of the gene, it makes somebody a carrier for it, but not affected. It is only in the situation where a parent passes on when each parent passes on one copy of the gene that has the mutation that a person ends up inheriting it and ends up being affected with a recessive condition. There is, as you can see, 4 different possibilities that end up boiling down to 1 in 4, 25% chance of having a child that's affected with a recessive condition, a 2 in 4 or 50% chance of having a child that's a carrier like the parents, and again, no signs, symptoms, or any issues associated with the condition. And 1 in 4, 25% chance of having a child that's unaffected with that condition. Now, for a person who is affected with a recessive condition, the chances of passing it on are actually quite low, because the most likely scenario for a person who's affected is that their partner is an unaffected non-carrier. And in that situation, it ends up being that the affected parent will always pass on one copy of the gene that has the mutation, but the other copy of the gene will come from the unaffected non-carrier parent and will not have a mutation, and thus the child will be a carrier like the grandparents, but will not actually be affected with the condition. If a person who is affected with a, excuse me, with a recessive condition does have a partner who is either a carrier or also affected with the condition, then that would change those risks. So in this situation, this person has a partner who's a carrier for the same condition, and it ends up being that there's a 50-50 chance then of having a child that's affected versus a child that's a carrier for the condition. If a person with a recessive condition would like to know their chances of having a child who is going to be affected with the same condition, their partner can have carrier testing to see whether or not that is present, in which case they can, and if they are a carrier, then there may be reproductive options that are available, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this. And of course, there are the X-linked recessive conditions, and these would be, for example, Duchenne or Becker muscular dystrophy, and some forms of Emery-Dreifuss muscular dystrophy, some forms of CMT. And in this case, this is the only place where it really matters if a person is male or female, because if you remember from the beginning that females have 2 X chromosomes and males have an X and a Y. So if a female has a mutation in one copy of her X chromosome, she's got a backup gene. She's got another copy of it over here that's still making protein and is able to pick up some of the slack for the copy of the gene that's not working. Whereas if a male has a mutation in his X chromosome, he doesn't have that other copy of the gene. The Y chromosome doesn't have it. And so he doesn't have any opportunity to rescue some of this lack of protein. So males end up being much more affected than females. Some females do get affected with differing amounts of disability based on having a mutation in their X chromosome. So for example, our moms of boys and men with Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy, we always want to test to see whether or not they are carriers for the condition. Moms are at risk for muscle weakness in some cases, but we are most concerned about their hearts and the cardiomyopathy that can occur when a person is a carrier for dystrophinopathy. But in terms of the way that these are passed on, mom will always pass on one or other of her X, and dad will always pass on his X to daughters, and will always pass on his Y to sons. So that's all my little arrows again, but it ends up for a mother who's affected with or is a carrier for an X-linked condition of 50-50 chance of passing it on, but it really depends on what that child inherits from dad in terms of whether or not they're going to be affected or be a carrier. So in this situation, you have a 1 in 4 chance of an unaffected female, 1 in 4 chance of an unaffected male, 1 in 4 chance of a carrier female, and 1 in 4 chance of an affected male. If dad is the one that's affected, it ends up being the same thing in terms of a 50-50 risk of passing it down. But again, men will pass down their X chromosome always to their daughters. So all of their daughters will be carriers. They are obligate carriers of the condition. They will always pass down their Ys to their sons. Their sons will always be unaffected. So I have a little raw males. So that's like the big caveat, is that men will, if a man is affected with a X-linked condition and is concerned about passing it on, then trying to pursue a pregnancy that is for sons is a way to prevent having this condition passed on to families. Genetic testing is a way to find out what is the cause of a person's genetic condition, what type of inheritance it is, what's the chance of passing it on, and what other opportunities there might be associated with that particular genetic condition. And sometimes we say, oh, it really looks like the symptoms that you have are consistent with myotonic dystrophy. Let's just do testing for one gene. And sometimes a person has gone through tons of testing and nothing can be found that gives them an answer. And then we're saying, let's look at your whole exome, or let's look at your whole genome, which can be thousands of genes at a time, and trying to find an answer. And they're basically looking at that, if you remember from one of my first genetic slides here, is that there's this DNA code. There's a series of letters that needs to be spelled in a certain way. And so they're going through and they're checking to see if there are any changes in that DNA code from what's expected. And there's really different possible things that can come from that. So there can be a positive test result where it says that this is known to be disease causing. This is the answer. This is the gene that's causing it. This is the inheritance. This is the risk to other family members. It can be negative, where all of the testing does not find an answer. That doesn't mean it's not genetic. That means the test that was pursued was unable to find an answer. It may mean that it's not genetic, but it is not by itself the answer that it's not genetic. And there can be variants of uncertain significance, where it's a change in the DNA code from what's expected, but it's not known if it's actually disease causing or just part of normal human variation. And these happen all the time. I'll get back reports with like 5 variants of uncertain significance on them. And sometimes it's easy to say like, oh, this is nothing. And sometimes it's like, well, this fits the person's presentation and it fits the type of inheritance we expect in the family, and maybe this is the right answer. But that's really up to your healthcare team to try to help figure out. And then over time, most of those variants of uncertain significance will be resolved, but it might take a long time. I also am really big proponent of Cascade testing, and the way that this works is that a new diagnosis is made in the family. One person is found to have a condition, and I will use an example of spinal muscular atrophy here, because this is new for newborn screening in many places in the country. So let's say a new baby is diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy. The first thing we usually do is test parents. Are the parents carriers? And we expect that they will be carriers. But then we have to say, who else in the family should have testing? Does the older sibling who's tripping need to have genetic testing? Could this person also have SMA? Does mom's sister who's currently pregnant need to have testing to see if she and her pregnancy are at risk? So I often help arrange for whole families to go through testing. I've had a family, I've done like 11 or 13 people in the family to see whether or not they are also carriers for the condition, to help inform their reproductive risk. And really, it comes back to this question though, like, what's the point? Why are we doing this? How does this help people? And I guess I don't always take the pro side, like you should do genetic testing. I am very much a equal opportunity listener, and I will say yes or no, depending on what are the values of the particular family. But here are some of the pros, I guess. So genetics matter because they can give a family a diagnosis, a name for whatever's happening in the condition, an answer to what is causing the weakness. And it can provide a community. It can give other people who have gone through the same thing and know what to expect in the future, a landing place for navigating this newness, as most people don't have a community already with other people who are disabled unless they have a disability already in their family. It does allow for family planning options for people who are concerned about passing it on. I will say again that this is not something that concerns everybody or every family. Some families will say that this is absolutely something they do not want to pass down or have another child with this condition. And other families will be like, I have lived with this my whole life. I totally understand it. I know how to deal with it. I know how to help a child with it. And I am completely okay with having a kid that has this. And both of those are completely reasonable, and it should be pursued if that's what the family prefers. There are also now genetic-based therapies, which we heard a little bit about earlier today. So I'll give, let's see, I've got maybe like a minute or so. Let me do a minute or so of family planning options. With my caveat that this is only if this is something that is of concern for a family. So there are many different ways to have a child that's not affected by a neuromuscular condition, if that is your preference. So there is CVS, or chorionic villi sampling, and amniocentesis, which can both be performed during pregnancy. There's pre-implantation genetic testing that can be performed before pregnancy. If a person has a neuromuscular condition themselves and is uncomfortable with the idea of holding a pregnancy themselves, then having a surrogate can be a nice option. There is also sperm donation and egg donation and adoption for non-biological child options. So CVS and amnio are both, again, performed during pregnancy, and in both cases, they take a sample from a pregnancy and are able to see whether or not the pregnancy is affected with a particular condition. The implication of this type of testing is that if a pregnancy were affected with it, then it would allow for an option for termination of a pregnancy and abortion. And it can also allow for more planning at birth in case there might be a concern for having increased risks at birth. Pre-implantation genetic testing is performed in conjunction with in vitro fertilization, so prior to pregnancy. And in this situation, you have an egg and a sperm, which are combined in a laboratory in a petri dish, and they are grown until they become an embryo that has become like the part that's going to become the fetus and the part that's going to become the placenta have separated. And then they would take a biopsy from the part that's going to become the placenta. And they take those cells and they can analyze those specifically, and then they can take just those ones that don't have the familial mutation and use just those ones for implantation and not use the ones that would be affected with the condition to hopefully bring about a pregnancy that is unaffected. And I will say, of course, this came up already, but this is kind of like the hope and dream. And the hope is that the genetic-based therapies and really any therapy that can achieve meaningful results to help people is going to be useful for people in achieving better quality of life. I don't think that for many people who are affected with a particular disorder that they want to take away their disability, but improving quality of life can be a really important piece of just living. And so a lot of these currently approved or clinical trials that are going on or upcoming, part of what they're really looking to do is help people achieve better quality of life. So I think that's the future. I think there's hope. I think that that's something that's going to continue to progress over the next decade for sure, but into the future, so that by the time your children are having children of their own, it's going to be a whole new landscape. So I will stop there and take any questions.
Thank you, Carly.
Sure.
We had a question come in, and I don't know if you can see it in the Q&A box. I'm going to go ahead and read it for everyone, but
Sure.
It says, how often do you see multiple variants or mutations within families causing several presentations of syndromes or disease? For example, on the same arm of the X chromosome, we have a known mutation on PHF8 and are undergoing testing for DMD mutation based on Becker found by muscle biopsy.
I'm like, want to go and read this again.
I know it's a long one, sorry.
Multiple variations or mutations within families causing several presentations of syndrome. So I will say, I'm not sure if I'm interpreting your question correctly, so please feel free to come back to this. But there are definitely different ways that people can present within a family with the same condition, so that there's both intrafamilial and interfamilial variability for many conditions, meaning that even within the same family and as well as outside of the family, people can have different presentations. I don't know this gene, PHF8. Now I'm going to look it up because I have the power of computers while I'm on a talk, which is just cool. And that causes an X-linked mental retardation syndrome. So XP11. Now I have to look at one other thing. So that gene, the PHF8 gene and the DMD gene are not actually super close to each other on the X chromosome. So unless that there was some kind of a complex rearrangement of the chromosome, it would be pretty unlikely for multiple things to happen that would disrupt both genes. It's not impossible. One of the things we say in genetics is that we never say never. Everything can happen in genetics, but I wouldn't expect them to be related events.
She says she was wondering if that mutation is causing the Becker's disease or if they have multiple variants.
It wouldn't, it shouldn't, at least from the you saw how long it took me to look it up.
Yeah.
Based on that, I would be very, it is not a cause of a dystrophinopathy. So if you are also seeing a reduction of dystrophin on muscle biopsy, then pursuing genetic testing of the DMD gene is very appropriate. And if that also has a variant in it, it depends on what kind of variant it is, but you might want to have a chromosome test that looks to see if the chromosomes are all aligned correctly and in the right order.
Okay. All right. And then she just had an additional question related to genetic selection for future generations. This was suggested for her daughter, carrier diagnosis. Is this available in every state?
So so there's a big push these days in the genetics community to offer what's called universal carrier testing.
Okay.
And this would be for people who are planning pregnancies at some point. So like, let's say, I mean, there isn't really an age cutoff here, but I'm just going to throw out there, let's say the person's of reproductive age, they decide to pursue genetic testing, probably need to be at an age of majority, so 18 or older, even though I think that might be a little biased. But anyway, so there's this panel that's like 300 plus genes that are associated with recessive and X-linked conditions to find out if a person is a carrier, with the idea being that if they are found to be a carrier, their partner then can also be tested to see if they are a carrier for the same condition. Okay. And then reproductive decision making can be used based on that.
Okay. All right. I do not see anything else. Thank you, Carly, for being here today.
You're welcome.